right, let me see if I can remember how to do this. I've been busy so long. I've been gone so long, but I'm back. And I hope people are still around to listen. Let's jump into Mark's story here. He's from Southern California, and here's what he writes. You recently said that you didn't know if there were Bigfoot in Southern California. Well, I can assure you that there are, and they have been there for a long time. In fact, one of the very first Bigfoot encounters I heard online was around 17 years ago, and it came from a former Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton Marine Base. My ranch was 9 miles up the canyon from the back of the base. Bigfoot stripped my fruit trees every spring. It scared my big dogs into their beds, and they silenced the millions of frogs in Deleuze Creek nightly and roamed the canyons around Fallbrook, Temecula Vista, I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce that right, and on to the border of Mexico. Los Monstruos de la Frontera, the monsters of the border, are no joke to the Mexican people crossing the border illegally in Southern California. A route they used to take through the back of Deleuze had so many people disappear, it isn't used anymore. Sheriffs, rangers, and border patrol agents and ranchers all have stories to tell if you're among the trusted to keep your mouth shut. Now, I too have had encounters. One scared me so bad that my bones turned to ice. At night, I would sit on my back patio with my two 80-pound all-business ranch dogs and smoke a cigar, have a beer, and watch the stars. This was how I relaxed after running my business all day. The frogs in the creek would shut up around 11 p.m. And at the same time, my dogs would slink into their beds in the garage. No amount of coaxing could get them to come back out, and I let them roam free, and some nights they would be out late, and then come racing back into their beds without stopping to sit with me. One afternoon, my sheriff friend came down my entry road and headed straight up to the barn without stopping. I was working up at the house, but he motioned for me to come on down to the barn, which was curious to me. Well, I met him there, and he asked if I knew of any holes around, meaning graves and waiting for thieves in the avocado groves, which include hundreds of acres in the area. Then he wanted to know if I'd seen a couple of suspicious guys around my property in an old pickup. He went on to explain that these guys were junkie thieves and they had disappeared a week earlier. They had told their gals that they were going to rip off my barn because they knew I had expensive equipment, and I guess the girls had cased my place with the guys. I told him that I hadn't seen anyone or anything, and then he went on his way. 2 days later, I awakened at 2 a.m. to find my two dogs facing the barn and growling loudly. I dressed and walked down to the barn with my shotgun and my two fierce dogs. I decided it was better to go through the trees and stay off the road in case I was about to surprise the junkie thieves. But when I got to the barn, I reached in and flipped on the lights as I leveled the gun, and there was no one there. There was nothing but me and my two brave canine companions. And then I heard a noise from down behind the barn in the equipment area, so I turned out the light and I acted like I was heading back to the house. But instead, I headed around the barn the other way. Again, nobody was there. I crept along the 80-foot-tall, 5-foot in diameter eucalyptus trees that lined most of the groves. Well, that was when I discovered that my fierce guard dogs were no longer at my side. And I looked back to see them standing at the barn 50 feet away, staring at me like I had lost my mind. "Get down here, you cowards," I yelled at them. And as I yelled, I turned my back on the eucalyptus tree I had been walking around. The dogs took off like a shot and ran full bore all the way back to the house and into their beds, whining all the way. It was at that moment that I realized that someone or something was behind me. If it had been a person, I knew my dogs would have tore into them. It was their ranch and nobody ever entered without my permission. And then I smelled it. It was a gagging smell that I've heard described on YouTube so many times. That was followed by a low moan. I dropped the gun barrel to face the ground. I let go of the trigger and I held it by the stock. And then with every ounce of courage I possessed, I walked slowly away, straining my ears with each step to see if it was following me. Well, thankfully I heard nothing. I reached the barn, turned all the lights out, inside and out, and then I jumped on my four-wheeler and I raced to the house. When I checked on my dogs, I found them still shaking and sweating. I got a beer and a cigar and I sat in the garage floor with them until they calmed down, and in reflection, I was thankful to be alive. Why didn't I turn around? It's because I was afraid it was a dog man. I already knew from the terrible experience a friend of mine had that you should never look at them if at all possible. Well, a few days later, they found the truck of the two thieves hidden in a defunct overgrown grove 900 feet from my barn. They searched for the thieves, but they were never found dead or alive. To this day, I don't know if I was spared because I was at my ranch and the Bigfoot ate my fruit that year, or if it was because I had a shotgun and didn't level it on the Bigfoot, or maybe it was another reason. God only knows, but I'm grateful. Now, in my life, I've known two Vietnam War veterans who were tunnel rats. They were the soldiers who searched the NVA tunnels and killed those they encountered. I met these two men 40 years apart. Their stories were identical. Unfortunately, so were their mental issues. They both carried a selection of knives and a .45 to do battle in the dark tunnels, so it's no wonder. They were ordered to carry the guns loaded, but one shot would bring hordes of NVA to them. Stealth was what kept them alive, so they actually didn't shoot the guns inside the tunnels. They weren't willing to take a chance. I'm telling you both of their names because they were brave men and they deserve to be honored for their sacrifice. Bud was the brother of Renee, a girl I worked with in high school. When he came home from his third tour, I met him. He was a scary being, a truly dark presence. The week after I met him, Renee woke up to find him on top of her, holding his K-bar to her throat. She had to yell at him several times before he got a grip on reality again. The next morning, he said his goodbyes and headed off to do his fourth tour, and it would be his last. He never came home. May he be in God's house today. The other person's name was Phil. I met him 4 decades later when I put my fifth wheel on a campground by a river in the Arizona desert for the summer. Phil was a hard man by this time, deeply troubled by his war experiences. People thought he was crazy, but he was my neighbor, and I spent a lot of time sitting by the fire, feeding him beers and cigars. So I had time to study him. I soon learned that he used that persona as a mental fence, but we did become friends. He didn't have much, but he was a grateful guy. I took him boating and bar hopping at the waterfront bars. Phil found in me someone he felt he could share his life experience with, but little did he know I was a counselor for years. I was empathetic, and I employed my craft without him realizing it. He was broken as Bud, and my heart broke for him. Well, one weekend I arrived early on Saturday morning. I knocked on Phil's door and expected him to be ready for breakfast and going for a boat ride. His car was there, but he didn't answer. Strangely, all the windows were covered in foil and paper from the inside. And I went to my place and made breakfast and coffee, but still there was no Phil. It wasn't until 5 p.m. the day that he appeared. He was pale and nervous and looking around like someone was going to jump him. I asked him what was wrong, but he wouldn't talk about it. But that evening, I made a fire and I sat down, and Phil came out to the fire cautiously. He took a beer and sat for half an hour without saying a word, and finally, in tears, he said, "I want to tell you what happened, but you'll think that I've lost my mind." Well, I laughed and said, "Hell, Phil, I already think you've lost your mind." And he punched my arm and he laughed too. "Okay," he said. Well, last night I was watching TV about 11:30 when something hit my motorhome. It sounded like a slap. I looked out the window and I couldn't see anyone. And then a minute later, there were 3 or 4 more loud bangs. This time when I looked out the window, there was this werewolf-looking thing standing there looking at me. Phil took a deep breath and added, and then 3 more appeared behind him and they started circling my trailer and they were slapping it. The biggest one stepped out and stared at him. He said it was telling him to come outside. He could feel it. He couldn't hear it, but he could feel it. He went and got his gun and laid on the floor for hours, thinking they would get in at any moment. I told him that we would look for the tracks in the morning, but his coach was sitting on gravel, so I knew they wouldn't find any. Mostly I wanted to take his mind off of it. We went through the motions the next morning, and I was right. We weren't going to find any tracks in the gravel. And Phil told me he had decided that it was a prank by Hollywood film students. He was guessing. So these guys drove 6 hours, put on costumes at nearly midnight, hung out for hours and filmed our coach and went back to Hollywood? I asked. Does that make sense? He looked at me with fear in his eyes and he said, "It's what I have to believe or I'll go crazy." I told him that I understood that, but pointed out that they didn't hurt him. They only scared him. I asked around the camp to see if anyone else had seen or heard anything strange, and many of our fellow campers were up by their fires at that time, and none of them heard a thing. Plus, the gates are locked at 10 p.m. A week later, Phil pulled up stakes and he left. Another week after that, I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of a loud bang on the side of my coach. I sat up and grabbed my 12 gauge just before another loud bang rocked my 40-foot fifth wheeler. I could see a shadow through my curtain, and I realized that this thing had to be 8 feet tall for me to see its head. I reached to open the curtain, but then I pulled it back when I remembered what Phil said about the wolf thing trying to mentally get him to go outside. Instead, I yelled, "I'm not Phil," and I racked my shotgun, the universal sound for get lost or get dead. Whoever or whatever was out there evidently got the message. It ran through the gravel to the fence and up the hill to the other side. The next morning, I found giant handprints in the dust on the side of my coach that were 11 feet up. There were scuffle marks in the dirt on the hill. And since then, Dogman has been confirmed on that part of the river. I noticed later that people quit walking around the park after dark. I never told a soul, and I'm pretty sure Phil didn't either. Now look, they're real. I've seen donkey kills, wild donkey kills in the desert. They're not the cute and fuzzy creature portrayed in some B movies. They're ugly and vicious looking. And that's the end of his email. And that, sometimes I couldn't tell in this story whether he was dealing with Bigfoot or Dogman, but this guy knows what's going on. I think in the first story when he was at his barn, it could be he first thought it was a Dogman, but then reconsidered and figured it was a Bigfoot. But his buddy, the men that he knew from the Vietnam War, this guy Phil absolutely says he saw something. Why would he make that up? I don't know. I don't. Some of these stories, I'm not sure what to make of them, but I do know they are great stories. And this was a good story. Okay, here's a story from the Northeast. The writer doesn't say to use their name or not, so I won't. I grew up in southern Maryland, surrounded by cornfields and forest. It's the kind of place where a kid's fun is instigated by their mother kicking them out of the house until dark. We spent a lot of time in the woods. When we went out for a walk at night, the moon was our only light. Now, granted, we lived on the Chesapeake Bay, so we had a lot of light bouncing off the water. My family's beach house was only a few miles from the Point Lookout Lighthouse, which was once a military hospital turned POW camp during the War of 1812. One of those major television ghost hunting shows did an episode from there once. Now, ours was an eerie place, so it was not uncommon for us to have a creepy feeling or to have strange things happen when we were in the back part of our property. Our lights were always flickering even when a new bulb was just put in, and we'd see dark figures in the back near the creek. We always stayed close to the house, or we went out front to the beach, and we avoided the back where the creek was after dark. Now, I've always had experiences with the ghosts and demons and cryptids. There was a house of a buddy of mine where strange things would happen to me at night. I learned that his brother had drawn a pentagram on his bedroom floor with his own blood. Sometimes I would feel someone sit down on the bed beside me when no one was there. Or between 3 and 4 a.m., I would feel the sensation of someone swiping their hand across me while I slept under the covers. At another friend's house, we would often see dark figures. One was a tall man in black dress clothes wearing a top hat. Once, when I was in the basement, I saw a dark figure with a body like a spider and a face of a human, but completely dark. I thought it was going to attack me, but then it suddenly withdrew back into the shadows. When we would ride our bikes along the path by the marsh, we always had the feeling that someone was watching us and the sensation that something was telling us to get out of there. But there was one time in particular that still has me a little baffled. I'm 24 years old now and I live in Washington, D.C. My parents divorced when I was younger and my dad moved to San Antonio. I only got to travel out there to see him twice a year, so we would try to pack everything into those short week-long stays. When I was 15, we went to visit a friend of my stepmom's who had a ranch about 2 hours from the border. It was near a town that was so tiny that they had a one-room schoolhouse with a bus that was actually an old limousine. The ranch was located down a seldomly traveled road in a small valley that wasn't much bigger than a ravine. The house was actually a double-wide trailer with a shipping container on the side, and the water was a 500-gallon tank that had to be brought in. The closest neighbor was a mile away, and we were there for 3 days. The first 2 days were not bad. Everything was quiet that first night. The second day, my father and I decided we'd hunt some boar and ride the ATVs around the place. There were paths all over the woods there, and my stepmom's friend pointed us in the right direction, and we headed out. My father was not a hunter. He was being loud, so I knew nothing was going to come our way. He couldn't help himself. He was an IT guy with the pinstripe shirts and the business pants hiked up to his rib cage. It didn't matter, though. We were having father-son time, and that was all that I cared about. While Dad rambled on, I began to get an eerie feeling like I was being watched. I looked all down the trails, hoping to spot a deer or some other animal watching us, but I didn't see anything. At dark, we gave up and headed back to the house to eat. And after supper, we built a fire outside. The adults were all talking, but I was staring at the fire and realizing that I didn't have anything in common with them. Sometimes I'd look up in the stars and mentally compare the sky to how it looked back home on the beach. Now, I don't know how long I sat there before an eerie feeling of being watched started coming over me again. I started scanning the woodline then. Just beyond the fire, looking back at me, was a pair of eyes, and it felt like our eyes connected. Something was telling me not to make any sudden moves, not to move at all. Now, mentally, I was running through the possibilities of what I was looking at. Was it someone who had crossed the border to rob us? There was a lot of that going on at that time. It wasn't a headlamp. It would have produced a lot more light as close as it was. But while I watched, I was blindly searching for my flashlight and phone without moving too much, and finally had to accept that I had left both in the house. But some time had gone by, so I felt safe enough to get up and grab the flashlight. Unfortunately, when I came back out, those eyes were gone. I sat back down and thought about what I had looked at. The color was sort of orangish red. If it had been headlamps, it would have been two people who were up in a tree because it was 8 feet off the ground, and they almost would have had to have their heads right next to each other. Eventually, the fire died down and we all went inside. We got ready for bed and played a few hands of Texas Hold'em and blackjack before turning in. I had asked my dad to sleep in the other bed in my room the night before and to keep a gun with him. There had been a lot of break-ins down there by border jumpers. An older couple was even held hostage and killed. I was terrified that someone would try to break my windows and kill me. At 3 a.m., my stepmom came to the door and started yelling for my dad to wake up. Someone was making a lot of noise outside her window. He got up and loaded his gun and went to check the windows and doors. I assume he didn't see anything because he went back to bed, and I didn't hear anything else from him the rest of the night. Of course, I couldn't sleep now, and I lay there staring out the window, certain that something was going to happen. And finally, I began to feel drowsy again, but just before my eyes closed, I heard what sounded like the boards creaking on the front porch that was to the right of my window. The footsteps moved across the porch, and the silhouette of an extraordinarily large human being covered the shades. When I got to the window, it stopped and turned, and I saw those reddish-orange eyes again. I couldn't make out any detail because the blinds were opaque to obliterate its features. But those eyes were clearly visible. It did a motion as if it was trying to look in on either side of the blinds, and then it moved on. I was wide awake now. It would be quite some time before I would manage to fall asleep. When we all got up the next morning, everyone went outside to look around. There were crushed pots, and the grill was open with grates lying on the ground. It looked like someone had dug through it and had stepped on the pots in the process. The adults all blamed border jumpers for the mess, but I kept wondering why they hadn't taken the pots and pans that were out there, or why hadn't they tried to steal the four-wheeler? We hadn't locked the shed, and there was a lot of other things in there as well. None of it was touched, and why would they take the time to bend up and break and crush the pots when they could have taken them to use or sell? Later that day, when we saw the Border Patrol drop by, the adults pointed and nodded knowingly. I wasn't so easily convinced. I still think that it was a Bigfoot that stepped up on the porch that night, and I think it was a Bigfoot watching us by the fire earlier that night. And it was a Bigfoot that watched my father and me in the woods that day. Now that I think about it, that would have been the veritable paradise for one. With all the boars and deer and farm pond up the road, not to mention all the trees for coverage, a Bigfoot could live a pretty lavish lifestyle right there. Well, that's a good story. You saw eyes, but you never really saw the creature. I think you said you saw a silhouette. That's kind of interesting. Austin, Texas, down in close to the border. There's a lot of people coming across the border now. I don't know if they're coming across there, but wonder if Bigfoot's giving them any trouble. This was a good story. I really appreciate the writer, and thank you for sending it. All right, that wasn't a long podcast. It's my first podcast that I've recorded since Thanksgiving, and I've been so busy. You guys have heard this story over and over, but I'm done with my work, and I'm going to be semi-full-time podcasting for the next few months. So you can expect the upload schedule to pick up steam, the podcast to get longer, hear more Steve Lilly on the Steve Lilly channels. I'm writing one of those. I'm actually about to finish one. Get it recorded, get it up soon. I've got audiobooks I'm working on that I want to get out. For the very few people who've waited for me to get back into this, I'm here. I'm back into it full-time. Not full-time, but pretty much full-time. And this podcast would be longer, but through the last 6 months, I have spent so much time in this office working on other projects that are a part of my regular business that I haven't spent much time with my wife. So I'm going to cut this podcast short. It's about noon on Friday. I'm going to go in there and see if she wants to go to dinner and maybe to a matinee this afternoon. And her and I just spend the rest of the day and evening together. And then this weekend, I'll be recording podcasts all weekend. So I hope to get several podcasts up over the next week or so. And I've also got a lot of fun things planned, different formats, different ways to present stories that have been crossing and running through my mind as I'm working on this other stuff that I think should be fun. They're going to take a little time, but I got to figure out how to do them quicker. But it should be add a little spice to everything for me. So I'm excited about that. Anyway, I got some good stuff coming. And for those of you who stuck around, the audience who stuck around, I really appreciate you. All right, that's enough talking. I'll see you guys on the next video. Thanks.